title, I had to look it up again, was from research to policy implementation. So I think this is a very broad and interesting and complex topic because policy implementation is always also depending on historical and cultural context. And in Switzerland, we have a specific context, as every other country also has a specific context. But we have, regarding psychedelics, an interesting history, and maybe there's something to learn from that situation. Even though I strongly believe that it cannot just be copy-pasted. So nowadays there are like attempts to for international collaborations to produce standards or guidelines that are aimed to be globally valid. And I think that's a good intention. And I think several things can be kind of put together and worked out globally. But many things hugely depend on the situation of the specific region. So I think it always needs some adaptation, but we can learn from each other. And so what we'll do, I think we have 90 minutes. I don't know if we'll fill that all up, but I'll take some time to show you about the history of Switzerland, because history always also has an impact on the situation we are in. So this is just one example of how history can shape a current situation. And I know Switzerland, so I'm gonna talk about this. And then we are going to address psychedelic access pathways, starting with clinical trials. And I'll show you some of the open discussions that are going on right now in the field. And we'll also have a look at other access pathways with a focus on Switzerland and its limited medical use option. And if it's of interest and we have time, we can look at PAT in practice, psychedelic-assisted therapy, that's PAT, maybe also training. And of course, along the way, we'll also have a look at some challenges that arise. Now, on the history. This is a graph from a paper that's almost 15 years ago was published by Franz Vollenweider and Michi Kometer about the history of psychedelic drugs in a very contemporary or Western context. So it neglects, of course, the indigenous use. So this is specific focus. And Switzerland played a role, as you might know, because already in 1938, Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD, and by accident in a way, when he wanted to develop a specific medication. And it's only 5 years later that he, out of intuition, got back to that molecule and discovered the psychoactive effects of LSD, accidentally again. And this day became well known as the so-called bicycle day, because Albert Hofmann, riding home from the laboratory back home on his bicycle, because he felt he wasn't feeling well after he had gotten into contact with LSD. So he wrote about this bicycle trip. So in the psychedelic community, the bicycle day is often celebrated. And he was accompanied by his lab assistant, who was Susi Rammstein. She was, I think, 20 or 21 years old at that time, so very young. And she would be the first woman to take LSD in June of the same year. This has become a little bit famous, like the tram day, because she would drive the tram in Basel. At this right side, you see a photograph of a woman doing pistol inoculation of a neurofry with ergot. And it's very interesting to look at the history also from an agricultural perspective, because there's a region in Switzerland where there was a lot of agriculture, and they would produce a lot of ergot for the for this drug company Sandoz to produce the LSD. So this had an implication for the agriculture back then. And of course, also when LSD was made illegal, this again had an implication for the agriculture, because that had specialized for the production of ergot, and this was then kind of, this broke down. So this had also yeah, very interesting. And I think this picture is also interesting because again, it's a woman and she doesn't have a name, and many women in the field, at least back then, are not known by their name. It's often the men that published, so they became famous. But we know that oftentimes the women along them, at their sites, they did a lot of work, especially the actual therapy with the patients was often done by the wives of these then famous men. Then there was, in 5 years after the discovery of the psychoactive effects of LSD, there was a first study in humans at the so-called Burghölzli back then. Today it's a psychiatric university hospital in Zurich. And then 10 years later, Albert Hoffman isolated and synthesized psilocin and psilocybin. And there's this connection to the indigenous people, because he isolated the psilocin from spores that Valentina and Gordon Wasson brought back home from Mexico, where they had participated in a ceremony with Maria Sabina, which is a Mexican indigenous woman that worked with psilocybin truffles, not truffles, mushrooms. So we have these connections also to the indigenous world. And then you know what happened. We'll get back to that later again, that LSD was prohibited. And it was a few years later that it was also prohibited in Switzerland. This is just the overview. I think we're going to talk about it a bit more in detail, because that's very interesting regarding the history. And a fun fact that psilocybin mushrooms were placed from the food regulation to the Narcotics Act in 1990s, which I think is also like cool to see. Now, going back to the 60s, when, yeah, you know, there was the hippie times, the 68 movement, especially in the US, as you might be aware. But we also had that a little bit in Switzerland, the counterculture. And when you think of Switzerland, I think you think of the mountains and cows and cheese. And of course, these are all stereotypes, but we know also that stereotypes are often more true than we might want. So yeah, we have mountains and cheese and cows. But so Switzerland had this kind of neutral position even during the World Wars. At least officially, it was a neutral position. And this counterculture movement was less tense than in the US. In the US, there was much stronger this problem of racism. And of course, the Vietnam War was much more close to the people, because soldiers from the US would go to that war. And in Switzerland, there was this political and cultural movement early on that they wanted to kind of protect the culture, the rituals, the values that are perceived as Swiss. So this was a like strong attitude or movement against totalitarian ideologies and fascism and so on. So it was kind of a protective culture. And still, we had this counterculture movement. Um, this became very strong in also 1968. Um, it was about establishment and a critique against the establishment. Um, and the young people criticized the rigidity of the institutions and like the um, yeah, conservative social structures. And it was not only students and young people, but they were also supported by intellectuals of an older age. Yeah, so also in Switzerland, there was a little bit of protest against the Vietnam War. And something interesting happened that some people in this movement, they wanted to like create their own lives far away from these rigid social structures. They founded communities in the mountains. I think that might ring a bell. So nowadays, we have people that want to become self-sustainable. They gather in groups and communities in nature. So this is a dream that also people back then had, and they founded these communities in the mountains, which were called Berglütlis, so mountain people, or little mountain peoples, if you translate that. And they experimented with spirituality and alternative ways of living together, nature relatedness, and also they experimented with LSD. So psychedelics were part, of course, of this counterculture movement, and they were in the US and also in Switzerland. And overall, it was a fight for democracy, for freedom, and development, personal development. Now, you have maybe seen some similarities, but also differences between Switzerland and the US. And I'd like to kind of zoom in a little bit and look at drug policy. So again, also in the context of drug policy, Switzerland had this more protective attitude or resistance towards international developments, and this was also true for drug policy. And very early on, so it was not only in the context of psychedelics, but also in the with regard to opium, because there was already in the early, like in 1912, this convention, so a first international agreement on drug policy, and Switzerland resisted to join this international agreement, and they only joined 1925, and only because there was an increasing pressure from the international community. So all in all, there's this reservation against involvement or dependencies. And of course, there was also the pharmaceutical industry in Switzerland. There is still the pharmaceutical industry. So this is a huge industry making a lot of money. And Switzerland was one of the largest suppliers of heroin. So there's always this neutral perspective officially, but there's always also maybe capitalistic interests or so involved. Maybe not always, but this kind of goes hand in hand. And as we already saw before, while there was a prohibition of LSD and psilocybin, the Switzerland only signed that a few years later, and they actually prohibited the substances only in 1975, while this was like 10 years earlier in the US. So when you think of that, like 1975, and that was the prohibition in Switzerland. And then it started with, like in Switzerland, psychedelic research started in 1919 again. Then these are only 15 years that there was kind of nothing going on. So, of course, it's not like yes or no thing. So it was a development, but it's not so much time if you look at the actual years. So Switzerland also had a different approach towards drug problems in general. So you know about the war on drugs. You also know the situation that the US is in now with the fentanyl opioid crisis, and also with cocaine, there was this war on drugs. And Switzerland had a very, very different approach. So there was this heroin um, problem in Switzerland and a very open drug scene. And instead of increasing prohibition and repression, Switzerland took the road to install a heroin program and would kind of mm, yeah, get in contact with the people and take them into this program so that they would get out of uh, this unhealthy and illegal and yeah, of this drug environment, even with their addiction. Yeah, as I said, early 1990s, Franz Vollenweider started psychedelic research again, or started psychedelic research after these years of prohibition. And it was interesting because Switzerland was an interesting partner internationally, also for the US, because of this kind of liberal attitude also from the authorities. In that, Switzerland had this somehow competitive advantage. And because of that, very strong connections emerged between the US and Switzerland. Because the US, they wanted to do the research, couldn't do the research, there was quite a bit of money. And in Switzerland, this was actually possible. So quite a bit of money was sent to Switzerland to do this kind of research. Yeah. And there were interesting people doing psychedelic research already back then, like Bleuler, Stoll, Dietrich, and so on. And today it's other people, it's Vollenweider, Preller, Quetno, Seifritz, and also our team. So this was kind of the research going on since the 1990s, but there was also a movement in the therapy. And so these were a group of psychiatrists and physicians that gathered together with an interest in psychedelics, and they founded this Swiss Medical Association for Psychedelic Therapy in 1985. And already in 1988, a few of the founding members of the SÄPT had the permission to use LSD and MDMA in psychotherapy. There was a first training initiated by the SÄPT. And then a few years later, there was the 100th birthday of Albert Hoffmann, which was a huge event, like an international symposium in Basel, which attracted a lot of attention, media attention, and visitors from like international visitors. From 2006 on, there was a MAPS funded study, MDMA and PTSD study by Peter Oehn and Verena Wittmer. So there again, you see this connection between the US and Switzerland. And shortly after, a first LSD anxiety study by Peter Gasser. And the more recent developments started kind of in 2014 with the start of limited medical use of LSD and later also MDMA and psilocybin. And we'll go into what is limited medical use later. I just start with a kind of historical overview. yeah, another anniversary and another study. And then since 2018, there's another training. There was another training cohort. And now we're in the current training cohort is the one that started 2022. Also, 2 years ago, new associations were founded in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, and also in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. So, we have 4 languages in our very small country, and this is kind of also interesting because it's almost like different cultures, and we have associations for each region in a way. But we, yeah, also try to collaborate and work together. And I'm a little bit proud because in March last year, we had a first collaborative workshop with the CIAS, which is the California Institute of Integral Studies. So kind of trying to open up, I think the newer generation is more open to collaborate internationally again and make connections. A little bit different to the general um, attitude of maybe stereotypical Swiss people. If you want to read more about the history, I can highly recommend these books. I think it's super interesting also to understand current developments, to look at previous developments. So that was a lot of history. Now let's look at some pathways to access psychedelics. So I think broadly one could say there's the pathway of legalization or decriminalization. Examples are in the US, Colorado, Oregon, also Portugal. I'm not very sure if there are cases for actual legalizations. I think it's mostly decriminalization, but I find this international legal landscape very difficult to really understand. Sometimes there are also wrong ideas about what is legal or what is decriminalized. Then there's the religious or spiritual use pathway. Examples are in Peru or Brazil, where traditional use of ayahuasca by indigenous communities specifically is not illegal. And in Brazil, that there are some churches that are allowed to use ayahuasca as a sacrament for their spiritual purposes. I must say that this specific pathway is by law not possible in Switzerland. So each country has some legal possibilities, and the use for religious freedom in the use of psychedelics is not an option according to the law in Switzerland. Medicalization is the third pathway, and there are again different versions. So one is the proper drug development, so bringing a drug to the market like any other drug. And then there are some alternative frameworks, which Switzerland is one of them. But let's just look at the drug development first. Maybe you are aware of the processes that a drug development goes through. So once a molecule or a compound is discovered, then it goes through preclinical trials, animal trials, then it goes through testing in healthy subjects for safety and tolerability, and only then in phase 2 trials it goes to patients, feasibility, and so on. And phase 3 clinical trials are kind of the last step before potential drug approval. And at the moment, I think the newest one is, I took that from Psychedelic Alpha. there you have this tracker of the clinical trials of psychedelics, which is interesting, but I think it was not up to date, or I did not go on the right page. But MindMed is the last or the most recent company to enter phase 3 clinical trials with the LSD for generalized anxiety disorder. Then there is Compass Pathways with psilocybin for depression, and also Usona with psilocybin for depression. Awaken is in ketamine phase 3. And of course, you might know Spravato, which is already on the market, also a ketamine nasal spray. And then there's Lykos, former MAPS, or now it's MAPS and Lykos, but Lykos kind of evolved out of MAPS. And they are developing MDMA for PTSD. That case of MDMA for PTSD is interesting, therefore I thought we can look at it, and it was kind of a huge happening last year in the psychedelic space, so I think it makes sense to have a look at that development. So Lykos is the drug development company that it's not actually true that it's former MAPS, because MAPS still exists as a foundation, as an organization, but out of MAPS, the drug development company evolved. And it was founded 1 year after the SÄPT, so back then. And yeah, in 2017, the FDA, the Food and Drug Regulation in the US, granted breakthrough therapy designation for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And already there, I think there are some misconceptions that breakthrough would be something like an easier access or less strict parameters for the evaluation or whatever, but it doesn't mean that it's less strict. It just means that it has some sort of priority given. So they had this breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA, and they started phase 3 clinical trials for MDMA in 2018. And yeah, 2021, I don't know if this might have been the hype peak around psychedelics, depending how much you're in the scene, and since how long, I would be very interested in hearing your perspective. But there was this Michael Pollan effect after the Michael Pollan's book about psychedelics, and also many drug development companies were founded, and most of them crashed in the meantime. So I think, yeah, there's an interesting development in the field. Then in summer 2024, let me see if I have, the high hopes. And in 2021, it was also the year of these New York Times headlines that the psychedelic revolution is coming and psychiatry may never be the same anymore. And like this was the tone in the media in that year. And then last year in summer, there was a FDA advisory committee meeting. This was public, so many people followed this meeting. And the advisors kind of were rather negative and suggested not to approve MDMA based on the data. And in August 9, Lykos announced that the FDA had actually declined or had followed the advisory committee's suggestion and declined to approve MDMA for PTSD based on the actual data. And some of the critiques were that the evidence was not sufficient. They critiqued also the unblinding, the biases. They also said, which is very important and also highly discussed in the field, the psychological intervention. So what is psychotherapy? What is psychological support? How is this standardized? What does it mean? And what does it contribute to the therapeutic effect? Yeah, and they, I think, also questioned the regulations once MDMA would be approved. And there was cases of therapist misconduct. So they said more data is needed. With that, I think we can go into some of the discussions or considerations, also methodological, because psychedelics kind of complicate clinical trials, because the RCT gold standard is challenged when we work with these substances, and you'll find out why, or we'll discuss why. So one thing is that generally effect sizes might be overestimated, because we know statistically the bigger the sample sizes and the longer something is being investigated, the more effect sizes, effect sizes decrease. So you see this, for example, in the graph, the bigger the sample size, the smaller the effect size. And also, this was the very first trial, very high effect size, and then it decreases over time. On the other hand, so usually clinical outcome effect sizes decrease over time. On the other hand, it might be that the effectiveness could be underestimated, because here you see, for example, a very important trial there was on the comparison of psilocybin versus escitalopram for depression. And you see that with both drugs, the symptoms decrease, but the difference between the two treatments was not significant. I mean, in numbers, psilocybin goes down more in symptom reduction, but it's not a statistically significant difference. However, I don't know if it's already published, but it was a preprint in October by Eduardo Schoenberg, and he said that, or he wrote that he's one of many that criticized the RCT, like randomized controlled trial, gold standard for the evaluation of effectiveness and efficacy for psychedelics. And I think one interesting thing to look at are so-called secondary outcomes. So if you have a clinical trial, you have to define a clinical outcome, and usually this is a rating scale for that specific indication, like a rating scale for depression symptoms. But many patients report that the symptoms might have decreased, or maybe not even so much, but their quality of life has increased, or their meaning in life, or the work and social impairments have decreased. So I think it's important to always also look at secondary outcomes to get a more complete picture. Then another topic that is hugely discussed nowadays in the scene is the subjective experience. So does that even matter? So you know that psychedelics have psychological effects. People have changed perception of themselves and others. They have intensified emotions and so on. And are these subjective effects even necessary? Or is it more the neuroplasticity in the brain, purely pharmacological, that does the thing, like that is therapeutic? So David Olson published this article questioning that the psychedelic effects are important, and he argued that it's more the plasticity. And then Yaden and Griffiths published another article with almost the same title, but a slight and important difference, and they argued that the subjective effects are actually possible, necessary or valuable, because many trials also found associations or correlations between the subjective effects and the therapeutic outcomes. It is super difficult to disentangle these mechanisms because once a person takes a psychedelic, all these things happen. So the neuroplasticity thingy might happen and the subjective. So how do you even disentangle? And nowadays there are some companies that are developing molecules that are very, very similar in the structure to classical psychedelics, but have slight differences, so they do not have subjective effects. And they argue that this will also help the patients. And I mean, there was one study with bromo LSD, which doesn't have subjective effects, and this was useful and helpful for cluster headache patients. So I imagine that for some patient populations, this might be an option. But I guess we will have to figure out for whom what kind of therapy will work. So I think it's a kind of a stupid discussion because there are so many different patients and we'll just have to figure out what works for whom. Because if I'm a cluster headache patient and I can just take a pill that doesn't cause any subjective effects, but it decreases my cluster headache, then this is fine. But if I'm a depressive patient and I have psychological material that I want to work through, then I might profit from subjective effects, like very simply put, but in reality, it's more complex. Another huge debate in the field is psychotherapy important? Is it psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, or is it rather just a psychological support, or even just a nurse supervising the patient, and that's enough, and the psychedelic substance does the job in a way? So there are different articles, yeah, talking or discussing these questions. And again, I think it's super, and also that's something that Gerhard Gründer and his colleagues also write, and I completely agree. It's super difficult to disentangle because imagine being a trip sitter for a study where it's supposed to not have psychotherapy, but then for the patient something difficult, challenging is happening, and he requires your support. And by protocol, you should not be like interfering because you should only be there for safety. So what do? I mean, it's unethical to not engage with the patient in need. So I wonder how that would have to be done. I think in San Francisco, they're right now doing a study where they try to compare different settings or different also attitudes from the therapist and so on. So it's a super interesting field, but also difficult to actually investigate, I guess. Yeah, I have this model for evidence-based therapy here because I think sometimes we confound evidence-based medicine with research evidence. And so as if only what we found in RCTs produces the evidence for the medicine. But according to many models of evidence-based medicine, we have different pillars contributing to evidence-based medicine. And of course, RCTs and data and evidence from clinical trials are a fundamentally important part of it all, and maybe the most important, but it's equally important to look at patient preferences and clinical circumstances, or in other models, it's also clinical expertise. So not to forget that patient perspective, clinical evidence, or expertise also contribute to the discussion or should be contributing to the discussion. Yeah, in that sense, I think it's great that more and more publications are out there investigating patient perspectives on certain topics, like here, Joost Brixema, on patient perspectives, and so on. So, yeah, as you're all psychologists, as I understood, let's make an excursus into psychotherapy research. And maybe you're aware of this verdict, Dodo Bird verdict, where everybody has won and all must get prizes. So this is from the Alice in Wonderland novel. And in psychotherapy research, this has been used to say, like as a conclusion from psychotherapy research, where it has been tried out to compare different therapy models or different therapy schools. And what has been found in meta-analysis and so on is that the actual therapy school or model doesn't really matter that much. It's more the common factors of psychotherapy that matter much more, like the relationship, all these factors, problem actualization, resource, oh, there's a typo, resource activation, and so on. So there are, depending on who wrote it, there are different general or common factors that contribute much more to the effectiveness of a treatment than these so-called specific effects of the specific therapy model. Therefore, every therapy school has won and all must get prizes. So that's one conclusion from psychotherapy research. And I like to see it, or in my head, it looks like this. And I try to kind of show it. So in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, we have this very complex situation that we have a compound, a molecule, with specific effects in the brain and on the organism. And it can maybe be explained in a biomedical paradigm, but we also have the component of the psychotherapy. We have also the component of the phenomenal experience induced by psychedelics. And this kind of challenges the biomedical. So part of it can be explained in the biomedical, but part of it goes just beyond. And one of these beyond paradigms could be the contextual paradigm explaining the factors in psychotherapy. And in that sense, psychedelics have also been framed as non-specific amplifiers, meaning that they just increase whatever is there. And if we're in a psychotherapeutic context, it might increase or amplify the common factors of psychotherapy as an idea or a model or a theory. Yeah, and we try to kind of challenge this idea that psychedelics just shift the paradigm in psychiatry and try to argue that it's not so much new, it's just a different combination of, or it urges us to integrate the different perspectives more. I mean, we're in a world or in a psychiatry at the time where we acknowledge that there's a so-called biopsychosocial model of psychiatry. You might have heard of it, biopsychosoziales Modell. So actually we know that, but psychedelics kind of urge us to really take that seriously. So I like to understand it that way. Yeah, I don't know, another finding or another argument or theory or model refers to the transdiagnostic perspective, that the psychedelics do not it's not that psilocybin treats depression and MDMA treats PTSD and LSD treats anxiety, but they have transdiagnostic working mechanisms targeting some underlying mechanisms more rather than just addressing the symptoms. So I think that's worth looking into if you're interested in these things. Now, from clinical trials, I think we saw the clinical trials development, and many of the current discussions and problems and disagreements. And from the clinical trial perspective, if you look at clinical trials, there are several things that make generalization a bit complicated. Of course, that's not only true for psychedelics, but some issues might be a bit specific for psychedelics. One thing is the not blinding, then the motivated patients and therapists and funders, especially in the face of the hype. Then also that during such a study, patients get a huge therapeutic attention, maybe more than in other trials. It has also been criticized to have short follow-ups, but I don't really agree. There are studies with follow-ups up to a year. I think that's comparably good for a clinical trial. Then there are still relatively small sample sizes. Yeah, we don't really have so much data yet, actually. Like compared to the huge attention that psychedelics get in society and by media, I think it's very interesting how little we still know in a way. Yeah, and also it's in clinical trials you have kind of a high standardization. It's treatment manuals. There are time restrictions. So let's say you have 3 preparatory sessions, a psychedelic session, 2 integration sessions, maybe another psychedelic session, and then another 3 integration sessions, and then you're supposed to have finished the process. So this is kind of time restricted. And as I already said, the outcome measures that you have to choose when you develop a drug, but they are somehow maybe not targeted for what psychedelics actually do and how they actually help patients. And once we think about the broader application, we have to consider how much we work with standardized protocols or how much we have psychotherapeutic flexibility. We have other patient populations, so we will have much more comorbidities than are allowed in usual clinical trials, where you have to decide for one specific indication. Costs and insurances are a huge discussion, and I think there are 2 papers from Elliot published on cost effectiveness. One was for MDMA, and then he also did one on group psychedelic therapy, which might be an option. Yeah, the training of therapists is also a question, the setting, paradigm, and focus, and so on. Yeah, so still a lot open. So sometimes I think it's maybe not so bad that MDMA is not approved yet, because I'm doubt a little bit that the psychiatric field is already prepared to implement MDMA in a broader scale. So alternative frameworks for the medicalization process are found in Canada, Australia, and Switzerland. Switzerland was actually the first 10 years ago. And yeah, let's look at that. So by law, we have this exemption article in the Narcotics Act that says that substances from the highest prohibition level can be used for limited medical use in specific exceptions that are granted by the authorities when a patient has a serious illness and he's treatment resistant, and you can argue that he or she might profit from the treatment. Currently, the used substances in the framework are MDMA, LSD, and psilocybin. And how it works is that a medical doctor usually a psychiatrist applies for for a specific individual patient, and then in the best case he gets a permission for 1 year. And if it helps but is not recovered yet, then you can extend this. Yeah. So it's very important to understand that this is not a first line treatment. So you cannot just treat everyone with LSD, psilocybin, or or MDMA, but it's really an exception. Here I show you some numbers. So it started in 2014. They do not have exact numbers for the first years, but I don't think it was more than in the year 2016 when they started to count. And you see that there's an increase in applications or permissions over the last years. Actually, I have numbers until August last year, so this is an old slide. But you see just the increase in numbers. You see also that psilocybin was available since 2021. You also see that, or psilocybin was not newly permitted, but it was just not available. So theoretically, you could also apply for other substances, but these three are used. And we know that, yeah, it's approximately, I think, in the meantime, maybe 80 physicians and more than 3,500 treatments overall, because we calculate, or we know that, or we estimate that most patients get maybe 2 to 3 treatments. Some only get one, and some come for 2 years and get a treatment every third month. So it varies quite a bit because we don't have a standardized protocol. Yeah, the indications that are most relevant are depression, anxiety, and PTSD, but there are certain cases also for addiction and some exceptional cases also of neurological disorders. Are you still with me? Is this interesting for you? Okay. Yeah, it's a lot. I try to give you an overview. Uh, yeah, the modalities, other than in clinical trials, they are responsibility of the physician. So they like also the indication, it's not fixed. It's not only psilocybin for depression, but you can, if you have a patient with a certain indication where there's at least a little bit of evidence in the literature, you can apply for it. Of course, they don't approve everything, but if you have good reasons and you back up with some at least case studies or better some clinical trials, then they are kind of open to it. Yeah, the patient and therapist decide for the substance. They also decide for the dose. They decide for the setting, frequency, and the physician, the responsible physician, can also work with co-therapists. So you see there's quite some flexibility and also quite some, let's say, transdiagnostic perspective in it. Yeah, maybe also to understand it's not an approved, like official treatment modality. So there's nothing like a gold standard or like a framework, because as we know, it's not approved medications yet. So it's also a bit a paradoxical situation that we're trying to develop standards for something that is not even approved. So much of what's happening in Switzerland is just based on experience, on implicit knowledge, on exchange network, continuous education, conferences, getting together, exchanging, and learning by doing. So I think this is possible because Switzerland is so small and has this very specific history. And there, I think you cannot just copy paste this model. It's specific to that specific country. I showed you the history, so I think you get a feeling of how it is. Yeah, and very sadly, we have only very little accompanying research. So Jasmin Schmid from Basel tries to has published something, and she also collects data. But because it's a treatment outside of study, yeah, it's a treatment, and we don't have too much data. But what I can say is that it seems to be quite safe, otherwise the authorities wouldn't approve it, because you have to write a report at the end of each year. And if they would see that things go really wrong, they wouldn't approve it longer. So I think this we know. Otherwise, they would just stop the whole thing. Yeah, we wrote about this in this article. It's in German, but I Google translated it. So I was quite surprised about the PDF translation that works so well. So yeah, if you want, we can also look at PAT in practice, if this is interesting for you. Then, so how does it practically look like? As I said, the physician is the one deciding for the setting, and there are various things to decide. So one is, do we work in an individual setting or in a group setting? Then also, is it inpatient or outpatient? If you have the capacity, if you have it in a clinic, you can work inpatient or outpatient. Physicians in private practice have been working with the substances since the beginning, but now in the last few years, also clinics start to work with it. Then how do you prepare the room? I show you here a photo of the center of one room. Actually, this was a study and not a therapy, but usually what we do is prepare the room nicely. So with gentle colors, some plants or flowers, something aesthetic, but maybe not overly intrusive. Yeah, I think there's a variation between more minimalistic and a bit more. I think it's also an individual choice. And I know that there are some people criticizing if there's a Buddha in the room, that this is too much, too much meaning, or that you're influencing the patient. I think there are, yeah, things you can discuss, but I think the most important is that it's nicely prepared so that people feel welcome and safe. And if you place a Buddha in the corner or not, I'm not sure if this makes such a difference. I think as long as it's authentic with who you as a therapist are, I don't think there's too much harm, as long as you don't put your worldview on the patient. Yeah, then music is an incredibly important part of it all. You can work with instruments. So you see here on the picture also we have two koshi bells and the bowl. But most therapists work mainly with a pre-recorded music from all sorts of directions. So again, I think there are so many opinions about the right music for PAT. And I think after all, there are some maybe guidelines or some ideas that make sense or not. But in the end, it's such an individual process. And it's also something that you, as therapist, feel authentic with. And also, there's maybe a difference between a music that you would put for a ceremony that is just nice and has a perfect perfect flow, and in therapy maybe you also want to experiment with different styles, and also get a feeling for the atmosphere in the room and resonate with that, with the music. So there's so much to say about music. And a colleague of mine, he said, if you want to have psychedelic therapists arguing, then let them talk about music. And I think that's true because, yeah, for many things, I think there's no right and wrong. Then, yeah, of course, who are the therapists and their attitude, that also belongs to the setting. Also, how is the location? Is there nature around, or is it in the city? Maybe do you have a backyard or so? Is an overnight stay possible? This is a huge issue. And also the overall structural process. Then, at least in the Swiss situation, we have a huge emphasis on the psychotherapeutic process, at least still nowadays. I think I can't say much about the developments once more people enter the field, but the practitioners up to now mostly have a psychotherapeutic orientation in a way. And in that sense, you can imagine the whole thing is like a process, and sometimes you have a psychedelic experience. And oftentimes we think of these three parts: preparation, psychedelic experience, and integration. But when you imagine having someone in psychotherapy and a potential psychedelic treatment is discussed, then I'm not sure how easy it is to differentiate what is the preparation for the psychedelic experience or what is the general process. And the same for integration. Integration happens every day with whatever we have experienced, and we go to therapy to be supported with the integration, right? So if a psychedelic experience is added to the psychotherapeutic process, then naturally the psychotherapeutic process will also be about the integration of the psychedelic experience. Yeah. In my case, we usually work in groups. And there, I think it's easier to differentiate, okay, that's preparation, that's the experience, and that's the integration, because everyone has their own ongoing psychotherapy, individual psychotherapy, but we have group meetings before a psychedelic experience, and we have group meetings after the psychedelic experience, and we have the psychedelic experience together. So we have, groups are differ in size between 4 to 12 participants and 2 to 3 therapists. So with my colleagues, we're always like the two of us. So I work with two parallel, and sometimes we have another assistant, like a student of mine. And on average, we have a cycle of 3 months, and every 3 months there will be a psychedelic experience. And we, as I said, we meet in the group before and after. So it's an ongoing group, and people, like the patients, will join the group. They join maybe for 1, 2, usually a year or two. And during that time, of course, they will have several experiences, psychedelic experiences, and they have their ongoing psychotherapy. And what we do also is that we have mixed groups. So some of the patients have the permission for psilocybin, others for MDMA. Sometimes we even have LSD patients in the group. And this goes very well together, which is something that many people might find counterintuitive because of the different effects. But our experience is that this is very valuable. Yeah. Maybe something historical, the differentiation between psycholytic and psychedelic. If you have heard about psycholytic therapy, this is historically more the European approach with a very low doses and more a psychoanalytic approach. Again, you imagine, or you like in the 50s, psychoanalysis was very prominent in Europe. So naturally, psychoanalytic approaches also went into psychedelic treatments. So it's more about biographical stuff and maybe having intensified transferences and so on. On the other hand, the other extreme would be the psychedelic approach. Historically, in North America, one or a few very high doses, incredible changes in consciousness and perception, transcendental and mystical experiences, existential things, and so on. And more like the idea that one extreme, sorry, I'm still a bit sick, one extreme um, experience would transform you. And I guess nowadays, like on the one hand, I think the highest dose we had was like 400 microgram. I don't think that in the US they work with 600s nowadays. And overall, I would say today we're mostly somewhere in between. We acknowledge and appreciate these more biographical experiences, and we are aware that in every experience also these more mystical oneness experiences can happen. And yeah, so usually we have several, like so many phases within one experience that everything can happen in one and nothing has to happen. So yeah, but still, also if it's historical, we still see more of these narratives of the mystical experience correlating with outcomes coming from North American labs, and in Europe, we publish more about maybe psychological insights or so. So I think it's interesting to see the narratives even in nowadays literature and the studies. Yeah, some of the challenges. So I think generally PAT is not a standardized standard treatment. Also, there's many patients and very little expertise. There's more and more high quality trainings, but still maybe not enough. And then also these paradoxical situations, why to offer training for something that is not even approved? And what are the standards? There's no binding standards. And how do we know what is best practice? And do we even have to define it? Or is someone who's a well-trained physician and psychiatrist, like in psychiatry and psychotherapy, there is flexibility. Can there not also be flexibility in PAT? So all these questions that are discussed but not really answered. And I guess while we're developing from niche to increasing numbers of patients and also therapists, we kind of have to also develop some sort of standards. While I think it's still good to not like over-regulate processes or practices. So how to standardize and maybe create guidelines that don't make the therapy too inflexible. Yeah, then also how do the formalities work? And then like how does it work with the substances and also with the reimbursement, which is like totally not represented in the insurance system. So many either patients pay it themselves or therapists work for free or for little money. So how does this all work, and how will it be translated, and how will it develop once there's increasing numbers? And also translationally, what the like can we kind of implement similar practices into other countries that have not had the same development? So it's I think we still know very little, and while the substance can be scaled, so we can produce kilograms of LSD, expertise cannot be easily scaled, and experience, so this always needs time. And it's also a super paradoxical situation to think of training therapists for a potential future situation where the substances will be medications approved. So many countries are now having trainings without even knowing if we will ever have MDMA or psilocybin approved. So this is a bit, yeah, paradoxical. And then I think psychotherapy in itself is already a challenge. Also issues like the informed consent. How do you want to inform someone about something that cannot be put into words? How can you have agreements about potential future events under the psychedelic influence if the patient has no idea what will happen and you also don't have any idea? Then also, I think one of the challenges is the big hopes that patients have. Maybe also the therapists, but I think therapists working in the field, they are all confronted with the reality. So most therapists, I think, have quite realistic expectations in the meantime, because these substances can be valuable, they can lead to transformative experiences, but certainly not for everyone. And for most patients, it's still a very painful and long process. And for some, it really doesn't work at all. So there are many open points or critical points to discuss in the framework of psychotherapy. I think we can skip the training part because I want to give you some time for some questions. Yeah, one big question, of course, is if psychedelic personal experience should be part of a training or not, and so on. Yeah, that's also not so relevant. But here you see the whole world and little Switzerland in red. Yeah, and it's interesting that there was this LinkedIn post about Switzerland is at the forefront of the psychedelic renaissance, leading the way in the development of guidelines for psychedelic-assisted therapy. So this very small country has developed guidelines. So we did some work collecting the expertise from the people working in PAT. I'm not so happy with the two names of me and Peter named here because the actual treatment recommendations have many authors. So we collectively created these recommendations based on what's known from clinical trials, but also based on the experience. So it's really kind of a document that shows what has been done in the last 10 years, what are the general practices, and it's backed by the associations and the practitioners in the field. So I think it really represents what we're doing. But again, I think that it's also specific to our country and our circumstances. So yeah, in a nutshell, different pathways and psychedelics challenge the biomedical paradigm and also the gold standard of drug development. I think it's a long way from clinical trials to broader implementation. You have learned that we have used psychedelics since 2014. And even though it's a very specific situation here, I wonder if there's something to learn from what we've been going through or what we are still going through. I think now with all the developments, it's also important for us in Switzerland to open up to the world and learn from what's going on in other countries. So yes, there might be something to learn from us, but we also have to become more open. And I wonder what's next. And I just realized I didn't really talk about policy as a word, but I think it became clear that it's a complex field and implementation requires so many considerations from policy and ethics too. Yeah. And I think, yeah, further information I can send to you, the links if you want, and that's kind of it. And I hope we still have a little bit of time.